Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You have reached the No Name Cinema Society, and this is episode 57.3, where we're going to do our classic movie discussion of this particular set of episodes. And we're doing more exploration of 60s films. We did The Wild Bunch in May, and now our very different 60s film, John Cassavetes' film, Faces. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here this evening. I'm in, if you remember, Nick Danger's apartment here in Nolita in Manhattan, which stands for North of Little Italy for those unacquainted. With that, I'm going to introduce a couple of other Yankee fans that are with me this evening to discuss Faces. First, a chairman of the board, a frustrated and philandering husband. Jim Carroll is here, ladies and gentlemen.
Philandering? I hope Vic doesn't see this.
She doesn't watch anyway. Jeopardy champ. And of course, the other host with us tonight is a young cad who likes to pick up married women at bars. Ladies and gentlemen, George Pappas is here.
Hi, guys. Here I am.
Now we met our panelists. The next thing that we do is we go over the schedule of this current set of episodes. And it started on Thursday. And this past Monday was our Indie Spotlight, another Joaquin Phoenix film called Two Lovers. Of course, now is the classic movie discussion. And this upcoming Monday will be our 41st Sound Off, in which we're going to have George back. We're going to play the movie game. We're going to do a segment called What's Their Bucket, which focuses on character actors. And I've been tasked with counting down my top 5 John Cassavetes films inspired by tonight's discussion. George, are you going to drink with me tonight?
Nope.
I understand, but I'm going to go all out with the little cab sav here. And so, go. Let's see if that gets me through the broadcast. If not, I might have to re-up. It's 2017 Cab Sav. It's a very good year. Okay, so you guys ready for what's next? It's the trivia time. I don't know if you guys remember what we had on for the trivia segment, but on the last classic, I said that the trivia was one of the pioneers of American independent cinema released his first film in the year James and I are studying. James Patrick and I are studying 1959 this year. On our next classic, we'll get to look at the first of this director's films to get Oscar attention. Of course, John Cassavetes is the godfather, or considered to be the godfather of American independent cinema, starting in our year of 1959 with the film Shadows. It would take until this film, Faces, in 1968 before the Academy acknowledged Cassavetes as a director, honoring the film with the Best Supporting Actor nomination for Seymour Cassel and a Best Supporting Actress nomination for Lynn Carlin. Coincidentally, the person who beat Lynn Carlin was Ruth Gordon for Rosemary's Baby, a film that features John Cassavetes. It was a decent year for Cassavetes at the Oscars that year. Are you guys ready for the summary?
Yes. Yes.
Thumbs up. It's a very hard film to summarize. Faces, Richard and Maria Forst are discussing getting a divorce, and each goes out to explore their options with their friends and colleagues in the strange times of 1960s Los Angeles. That's the best that I could do as far as the summary is concerned. You guys feel okay about it?
That gets to the germ of what the plot would be, yes.
It's probably the hardest film I've had to summarize since being in charge of the summaries. So that brings us straight to opening thoughts. So let's see how that goes. And George, you tend to be better at it than Jim, so why don't you go first? Opening thoughts, one sentence or so.
One sentence. I thought of 2 other titles that I think would have been great for this film as well. One is Long Day's Journey into Night, that I think somebody used that already. The other is Mask.
I still don't have a sense of whether he liked it or not, but I guess we'll get to unpack that later. Jim, how did you feel about the film?
I mean, I kind of thought it was a 130-minute boxing match. Do I need to go more than that?
That's one of his better opening thoughts. No, that's how you do it. One sentence or less. He did it, ladies and gentlemen. He's finally figured out the opening thought situation. All right, so we screened this film in April 16th of 2016, a day that was kind of fun because it featured an early screening and then racing down to San Diego to a Padres game that wound up going extra innings. So it was a long day that started with the screening of the film Faces, but fun. As I said in the last classic, I lost a bunch of the recordings that I used to take at the talkbacks, but this screening is old enough. It's 3+ years old now that I still have this particular the talk voice memo of the talkback. And my favorite quote from the screening was that an amazing film and I'm not with it enough to understand it? was what one person said. Another person said it reminded them of conversations at a party where they didn't know anybody. And as a result, it was uncomfortable and anxiety inducing for them. And that sort of summarizes, what the group felt when I screened it in 2016. My opening thought is I was more interested in the ideas and concepts than the actual execution. And so in that sense, I want to start with the direction because there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm going to go through pretty much all of the things that I want to say about direction. So I'm going to ask you guys to sort of pay attention and maybe make mental notes of the things that you want to come back and talk about, because everything's sort of related to one another. So I'm just going to flow through a bunch of the different directorial choices, and then if there's something you want to pinpoint, feel free to go back. And the first thing I want to talk about is the blocking. Interestingly, it feels as if there's no set blocking for the camera. As if the actors are free to roam the space and the camera and edits either follow them or they don't. The screening attendees actually felt this was noteworthy as well, even saying it felt different and interesting even by today's standards. And I like this. I like this choice. And in that sense, it reminded me of an indie that George and I did in September called The Girlfriend Experience. I also think he did a terrific job with the mise-en-scène, very detailed in spite of the low budget. Did you guys notice what pictures seem to cover the walls of a lot of the interiors? Pictures of what specifically?
Like women.
The answer I'm looking for is it seemed that he was taking the title of the film very literally in more ways than one. There were constantly pictures of faces throughout, really hammering that home. That idea extended to the camera choices as well, with a plethora of very tight close-ups. It makes sense for the movie, but I still didn't enjoy it. They were too tight. I have that issue with many of the Cassavetes films that I've been watching for the Sound Off coming up on Monday. Generally, I think more of a mix between tights and wides are what you need to tell a story effectively. In that sense, this felt like more of an experiment. On that sense, the craft elements of the film were kind of sloppy on the whole, particularly sound and lighting. It's forgivable given the budget, but worth mentioning. It would perhaps be more forgivable if I was more invested in the film overall. And the aforementioned close-ups put the onus on the actors, and they pretty much delivered, especially in those close-ups. I also just mentioned the freedom they had to roam the space, but I wonder if it was too much freedom overall. The film sometimes feeling like an improv scene that was dying. Everyone in this panel has been there. The actors all sound very similar to each other in the way that they talk, frequently using repetition and prone to pontification on various existential subjects. I think there was an attempt to capture real people and real problems, but people don't really sound like that in real life. And while they do talk over each other in real life, they don't to this extent, which brings me to my final point about the direction, and that's the style itself. In his efforts to seemingly capture something real and honest, Cassavetes perhaps took it too far to some kind of hyperrealism, a stylization all its own. It's unique, but it belies what I think the original intention was. While they're messier and less contrived and less written than characters that we're used to in movies, they are perhaps too messy, too undefined, and not subtextual enough to really capture naturalism, realism, verisimilitude in the sense that I think they were going for. Certainly more than what audiences in 1968 were used to.
There's never any breaking attention. The characters were so unpredictable in the way that they slid from emotion to emotion. I, the viewer, couldn't settle in and sort of think about what it was I was watching.
Okay, so is that good or bad? Does that make the film more engaging, or did that make you feel less invested?
I wanted to see these characters have a moment, rest and reflection, instead of constantly finding themselves back to a fight. There were no breaks.
It seems like it's the pace that you're responding to. Soderbergh, who directed The Girlfriend Experience, which this film reminded me of, and I think was influenced by this film, still talks about the concept of rhythm and release. He feels like a lot of film after a fast-paced sequence needs a break or a breath, so that's interesting. Real quick, Jim, was this your first time seeing the film?
It was.
George, it was not your first time.
No.
How do you respond to my comments about the direction?
There's one thing I don't agree with you on. I read a lot about John Cassavetes. He did want things to look very spontaneous and not planned out, but I think he did plan most of his camera shots out.
I understand that's likely the case. I'm just saying how it felt, like how it seemed.
Seemingly free-form dialogue would end up, say, with Gena Rowlands and John Martin, with Richard and Gina going to a chair, leaning over it, and they would be in a two-shot for a while, and they would break apart. I thought it was very actually orchestrated. Faces, when you first watch, is a bit of a frustrating experience. You're not repelled by it. In fact, it is compelling. You wonder where you're going. I think that these are all people who don't know themselves. And they want other people to know themselves to make it easier for them to know themselves. And it's actually often, I think, very funny. It does lighten the mood with unexpected humor. One of them jokes about someone else making a fool of himself. A lot of them aren't afraid to make fools of themselves. And it is funny to watch it happen. But I do think directorially, comedy is used to lighten the mood here and there throughout the film. You can never settle in on the comedy. You can never settle in on the potential tragedy. It goes up and down like a seesaw.
I do want to respond to your thought. For me, I was saying in terms of the camera choices, I wasn't saying that they weren't orchestrated. I was saying how they felt, that they felt improvised along with the dialogue. It felt very free-flowing, and that's an accomplishment. That was actually like a compliment and not a complaint. The fact that it was orchestrated in that way and it still felt as free and alive, I think is one of the best qualities of the film. So I just want to point out that we weren't necessarily saying different things.
Okay.
Jim, do you have anything on the camera work?
I agree that it felt very flowing, very natural.
Excellent. Everybody agrees on that. Good. Which leads me to the performances. And as I alluded to earlier, I think on the whole, the performances are pretty strong. Everyone's sort of believable as people. The scene work itself is strong. Although, as I sort of alluded to in terms of Cassavetes' style, I feel like the actors are occasionally allowed to veer the scene out of control, and that's like every scene. In that sense, no one performance stood out to me as being exceptional in spite of the 2 Oscar nominations. Conversely, no one bumped for me either. All are solid. I'm not going to say that Cassell and Carlin didn't deserve the nominations. Cassell's maybe a little more suspect to me than Lynn Carlin, based on the nominees that you're neither deserve to win. Guys, did you feel like any performances stood out to you in any way? You're both actors. What do you guys think?
I thought it was a great ensemble. I thought they were all really excellent. Lynn Carlin particularly strong. She had a lot less dialogue than everybody else. Lynn does a lot more listening and taking the things in. I always felt the look on her face. It drew me right in. When she came out of her attempt to kill herself, the way she came out of that, coughing and then sinking back, I thought that was really stunning. It did not look like somebody turning on the water, on the dramatics at all. Like we were flies on the wall of a really harrowing scenario. I was very pulled in by all of their performances. These people, to me, are very vivid, and I have thought about their performances over the years.
Jim, the actors, anybody stand out?
I'm not going to say anything against what George said. I especially love the moment where Seymour Cassel has the phone. The emergency operator's like, what's the number?
I talk about these people wanting other people to change their lives. The one person, really, who actually doesn't expect someone else to do what he needs to do, takes charge right there. I didn't even realize that until you said it, but it's true. He puts that phone down and he goes to help her himself.
He can either leave or he can help. It's on him.
Yeah,
There is nobody else. Before we even get to the marriage setup, the opening scene after Freddie's out of the picture, when the doc was at the door, was that a tight close-up on her face, grabs Richard's neck and yanks him around. There's just something in Jenna Rowland's face of desperation and charge. The people who don't know what they want think she's the one who's trying to do something, but it seems to be the wrong choice.
I think she's well aware she doesn't know how to be herself. She knows how to sing about Jean with the light brown hair. She knows how to talk about Peter Piper picking cats and pickle pumpkins. But at the end of the day, he's tired of his own trite life and he's reaching out to her for something different. And he's starting to realize it's not going to come from her, but he believes she has it in her. He says that to her, please, let's just stop playing games. Let's connect. And she doesn't do it. She runs away. The sight of her alone, taking that in, I think is one of the most effective moments she's ever had on camera. But she's the one who came away with the Oscar nomination for this movie.
So we're all agreeing everybody's good. No one was like exceptional.
I thought they were all exceptional.
I'll second that.
So in that sense, I guess we disagree. I do think that maybe they were, like I couldn't help but feeling like the inmates were taking over the asylum in certain scenes. I just felt like maybe things were overplayed a little bit throughout the movie, and that was part of the style that I was getting to earlier. And everybody had some great moments, but and the director supplied those moments. Even the tertiary characters had monologues now and then. You know what I mean? And that sort of leads me to my next thing, which is the screenplay. And I'm going to say something similar to what I did about The Girlfriend Experience, which is an indie that George and I did a review of in September from Steven Soderbergh, in that the plot is secondary to character, and in this case also to style. Things do happen in Faces, but in a meandering way. And as I just said, almost every character has a moment, whether it's a monologue or some other sort of private moment, even if they're a smaller character. And even though those moments don't advance the plot, or let's call it the main plot, I'm not necessarily calling that bad, but I do think you have to be patient with it. And a lot of audiences don't want to necessarily be patient with their movies. I don't want to say it wasn't compelling. It was interesting enough, but I didn't find myself fully invested either. Anybody have anything on that?
I had a problem with the fact that it's always tense, but I still think these actors are exceptional. If you had lesser actors, this would be a horrible movie. The way that there is no break is from that screenplay. I think the meandering that you're talking about happened as a result of the screenplay that constantly is, rather than resolve the scene to the objective and the intention, it's so much back and forth that it unsettles the whole scene. I start to lose what the scene is about, and I become more worried about the people in that scene than where we're headed, because I don't trust anything that's happening. I don't trust them when they laugh because I think it's the violence, and when or anger. And when they're angry, I'm not trusting that they're getting over it. I don't believe that the objective of the scene has been satisfied to move on. It feels like it's recycling the same point with very little forward movement. I don't think that it's clearly a directing or acting issue.
You know, it is in the sense that the director and the writer is the same person, and it's all sort of, he's writing as he's directing and vice versa. I see your point, and I think we're saying the same thing. Either way, it's a part of the style of the film. And yes, I don't blame any of the individual actors for them sort of taking over the scenes. That's where the director needs to step in and rein it in and shape it a little bit. That's what the director is meant to do. And he was sort of allowing them to sort of do their own thing. And I felt like at times things got away from the thrust of the movie, you know what I mean? And that's the meandering I'm talking about. And so that's why I did put it in this plot section. As a story, it does sort of zig and zag and wander a little bit. And part of it is because the actors are all over the place, but I don't blame them because they all did it, which means they were sort of directed in that way. They are part of the vision of what Cassavetes had in mind. So that's the choice that I'm taking issue with, that concept that I think in his mind he thinks is more realistic, but it's actually, you know, I use the phrase hyperrealism. I'm sort of, I might not be using it properly, but I'm just for lack of a better phrase.
I don't dispute anything you said there. I think that is very much a part of the Cassavetes style. It's indulgent in that particular era. It was eye-opening. You know, I have read that he really resented the editing of A Child Is Waiting, which I think is the last movie he directed before this one. He was basically acting between 1963 and 1968.
63, yeah.
He has complained about the more commercial results that film shows in the end. But actually, I think there's an admirable blend of studio polish and his rawness that makes that film better than he gave it credit for being.
Let's not get too much into Child Is Waiting because I've got a top 5.
I'm not going to say another word about it.
I've got a top 5 Cassavetes coming up.
Just saying that I could see where his style actually could have benefited from a friend with a more commercial bend. What he was going for didn't have to be entirely compromised if he were to think along the lines you were describing to avoid those constant peaks. Does that make sense?
You seems like you have some admiration for it. I'm still unclear whether you actually like it.
Oh, I like the movie very much. Is it something that is a completely pleasurable experience? No. Is it something that is haunting and stays with you and makes you ponder the stories behind the people you are looking at? Because behind those faces, there could be so much need that you don't see right off. Yes, I actually like it very, very much.
That brings me to the other part about the screenplay, and that is character development. And one of the main things that came up in the screening, and I think this is sort of an offshoot of what you just said, George, is likability and the inability of the audience at my screening to identify or empathize with anyone. I don't have as much of an issue with this generally as other people do, or as Devin likes to call them, lay people that come to my screenings. Their inability to identify with these characters really separated them from the movie. They felt a disconnect. And to their point, in the brief glimpse that we get into these lives, for the most part, we see their darker sides. And that's why it's a little beyond realism. Because there's an occasional reprieve for some, but there's something somewhat misanthropic about the final product. And George, you just used the word haunting.
Interesting.
The audience made me think about this. What do you think?
I would not call it misanthropic. When this movie was released, I was a kid. Looking at some of these characters, particularly the older men, I had relatives, I would see people that were a lot like that. They were drinking all the time. They were loud. They were boisterous. They didn't think about the fact that they might be dominating the room when people didn't want it dominated. This was very much what adults sometimes looked like to me. Not in my own home so much, but there were certainly people who visited where I saw this going on quite a bit. And watching these people kind of hit home. I remembered people who were like that. You don't see them as much anymore. This is something that did strike a chord with me. I'm not telling you I could relate to it, but I certainly saw it. And it was interesting to think of these braggadocios or larger than life people having such need underneath that, which I never thought of when I was that young. A lot of the things that were swept under the rug before this film are not swept under the rug at all anymore.
Yeah, there's no question that this is trailblazing. I'm not necessarily taking away its place in history. I acknowledge that, but I'm sort of looking, us in modern day with our modern perspective, and evaluating and looking at it from that point
Yes,
of view.
and I'm telling you,
Jim,
I saw people like that when I was too young to understand them.
I
So,
understand.
yeah.
That's a different perspective for sure. Jim, you had a couple issues with the film. Was likability of characters one of them?
Likability didn't really bother me. I don't need to like my characters in a movie to be invested in their. As long as they're human in some way, and all of these characters very much were, I'm on board with that. Sort of to George's point, there was definitely the moment when Richard comes home and he starts rifling through the many cigarette boxes and going right for that drink and calling Rita to get him stuff, and she brings him dinner. And me thinking, this is not the way that life is really anymore. So much of what they're showing is sort of what this commonplace is in 1968 doesn't apply in 2019 and would be embarrassed in 2019.
Even by 1968 standards, some of their behavior was somewhat questionable. And I likability is not an issue for me necessarily, and we've had this discussion. Famously, Jim and I have argued about the likability of a character in a film called Rust and Bone. So I was curious how Jim felt about likability, because the audience, that was a very strong thing for them. I didn't have that particular issue with this film, but I thought it worth mentioning because that was such a big point they kept hammering home in the screening. It did make me think that no character, what we see of the characters in this small snippet, this small slice of life, is very, very dark compared to something more rounded, where we get to see maybe a little bit of lighter or happier or nicer sides of them. We're seeing something a little darker, which is going to lead to one of my T-word things, but I just thought that was interesting and worth mentioning.
The one place that I thought we saw a little bit of that was the flashback sort of that Richard has in the billiard room with him and Marie, where he remembers a better time for them. They're in bed, I think, and they're laughing and giggling. And
I didn't read that as a flashback. George, did you? Hold on.
No.
George, did you think that is a flashback?
Not really, but it makes me want to go look at it
but
again.
it goes back to him in the billiard room.
I feel pretty confident, Jim, that it's not a flashback.
It didn't feel like it was happening in real time.
It's the next day.
Oh,
He tells her that he wants a divorce.
It's the next morning.
yeah.
No, he can't, because he says, I'm going to pack my bags. Don't expect me home tonight.
Yeah, it's the next morning.
Yeah, it's the next day after they have gone to bed.
I don't think there's any flashbacks.
No, I think you're right, JB.
Let's look at that here, and there is an abrupt way. Like, scenes are so long, but then the transitions between scenes, and this happened a couple times, they are abrupt. Temporal relations are definitely thrown into question, and that could be construed as a flaw to the film.
Now I will have to go
that's a
back
pretty
to
significant confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with you being outnumbered and everything. Are you guys ready to go on to the T word?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's time for the T word, ladies and gentlemen. This is the section on themes that we call the T word because Davey was always afraid of the word themes. We had to sort of tiptoe around, but now with Davey gone, we can talk about themes wholeheartedly, and it's everybody's favorite part of the show. And I am going to start, and my first theme is going to be sexuality. At a time, because that's what I really took from this movie, at a time when sexual taboos were crumbling faster than LBJ's presidency, the adults of the time seemed to struggle with the residual emotions, the fallout, if you will. And they are like children when it comes to sex, the new sexual world around them. They're naive, they're petulant, somewhat grotesque, and ultimately confused. So that is one of the big things I took from this most recent viewing, guys, faces and sexuality.
I see that. For me, it was everybody seems lost. Sexuality, I think it's part of that.
I mean, that's true, but in this film, it is largely related to sexuality. Like, if you really bear it down to like the individual scenes, sex is underneath everything.
Everything.
Sounds like you agree, George.
Yeah, I do. I think they know they have a freedom that they never knew they were going to have, and they don't understand why they're so unhappy.
That's
This is
exactly what
wanna
I was
say.
thinking. What are you laughing about, Jim?
Oh, yeah, I'll do it too. Okay, here we go. There's a line that to me sums up this film, and it's a line from a Joni Mitchell song. There's no comprehending just how close to the bone and the skin and the eyes and the lips you can get and still feel so alone. That came to me while I was watching this film. They are so close, they're lying in bed with each other. Doesn't bring them any closer. Nothing helps. There's this sadness that none of them can escape. Everyone is so close to touching, to communicating, but they can't do it. It's just frustrating.
But the third theme I have that I was hesitant to bring up because the audience presented a theme that I was like, I don't know, the audience in the April screening in April 2016, they presented a theme. When I asked them, what do you think the themes were? And they used this word, and I was like, it's a little broad, but I thought I'd throw it out to you guys because I have it down here, and it is, to them, the theme is unhappiness. And that was the way they phrased it. And it sounds like that's where you're going. Certainly, no one in the film seems to be happy. Maybe Chet, but I'm not sure. Is their happiness or lack thereof connected to sexuality? Are these themes sort of connected to one another?
It isn't helping them.
I think unhappiness is a symptom and not the underlying condition.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree with that, which is one of the reasons I thought like it didn't work as a theme, but it was interesting that George brought it up because I wanted to throw it against the wall and see what you guys said with it. And it sort of is along the lines of what, George, you were saying about them, and you used the word sad several times.
Yeah, I don't think they're wallowing in their sadness.
No, and you seem to interpret as sadness as relates to interconnectedness.
To some extent, yes. Or maybe happiness is what I'm relating to interconnectedness, and because they don't have the one, they don't have the other.
Right.
I agree that sex is important, but I think it is much wider than that. I think they're adults, they got to this place in their lives, and they expected to have what they wanted. I mean, I think that there was a line that Richard said that stuck out to me, which was, I'm a mild success in a dull profession. It's not just their relationships, it's the entirety of their life. I think sex just happens to be a quick, hopeful remedy, a band-aid to the overall problem. It's all surface.
And also, they're prone to over-dramatizing things a little bit because, little things seem so much bigger to them in the present moment. So my final theme is sort of related to a film I keep bringing up, and I'm curious, George, if you think the comparison is apt. And so similar to the girlfriend experience, my other theme is monogamy. And I think the film questions the concept of monogamy, especially at this point in time in the culture. No one in the film, no one is faithful to anyone. Whether they actually commit adultery or not is irrelevant. They all want to or think about it or try to. So in this sort of related to sexuality, but in this concept of this new freedom that we've referred to as sexuality, this idea of marriage and one person and making that commitment, this comes up a few times in Cassavetes' world. So I think it is in there. George, anything?
Yeah, I it's very true. I mean, even when the three women are in the room, that one of them is being told she's making a fool of herself, is like, hey, I'm raising kids, but she's there looking to get laid.
It's like me and Jim every Friday night.
If anything, I think they're finding or uncovering in this movie that their sexual freedom isn't necessarily going to leave them any better off than a monogamous life. I think when Richard comes home, he wants to make amends. It's too late.
Oh, for sure. I think they're also somewhat finding that you talked about closeness. And I feel like it's one or the other. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like they're eschewing monogamy and looking for closeness elsewhere when the closeness that they had wasn't enough. As a longtime married man, Jim, I wonder how you respond to this theme.
You can't shut that part off of you biologically just because you're married. You can't stop finding people attractive.
I was pretty sure Vic had it beaten out of you.
That comes along.
It is in the film. Like, you at least agree that this film is asking those questions, not necessarily finding those answers, but it's asking those questions, I think.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a what I have versus what I want fight that's brewing in almost every scene.
All right, cool. Are you guys cool if we move on to the showdown, or you guys have some more themes?
No,
No,
I am not doing well, and I would like to move on, actually.
So it's time for the classic movie showdown. This is a fan's favorite part of the show where two movies go head to head in NCAA style brackets. So we're explaining that shortly to sort of give you a sense of what this is all about and what Faces is going to go up against. George is going to read the rules for us.
Okay, hold on. The rules for the classic movie showdown. Seeding criteria varies from bracket to bracket. 2, films at JB-hosted screenings need to be 15 years or older before 2004. Voters are eligible if they see both films within a 12-month period. Voters must see both films in JB's presence. JB is ineligible to vote, but like the Vice Presidents of the United States, he breaks ties.
All right, so those are the rules. And so tonight we've got the 60s bracket, and we've now completed the first round of the 60s bracket. It's the only bracket where we've gotten through the first round, so that's 32 matchups, and now there's 32 films left in that bracket. And so we'll be going through them as we go, revealing the winners of each of the brackets. And tonight, Faces is a 16 seed. I wonder if, Jim, you know what a 16 seed goes up against in a first round?
I believe it goes up against the number 1 seed.
It goes up against a 1 seed. Jim, the Jeopardy champion, knows his brackets. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the Faces number 16 seed goes up against a number 1 seed, which would be a big film of the 60s. Billy Wilder's The Apartment. The Apartment versus Faces. Very interesting, very different film. A film from the beginning of the decade in The Apartment to a film from the end of the decade with Faces. So the vote happened at the April 2016 screening. So there's a pre-winner, but I always let these guys opine before I reveal a winner. Jim, had you seen The Apartment before this weekend?
I saw The Apartment many years ago.
Okay. But you rewatched it this weekend, right? You said?
I tried to. I did not get a chance to watch it.
Fair enough. But you've seen it before. So if you had voted, what would you have voted for?
From what I remember of The Apartment, I would have voted for The Apartment.
Jim's with The Apartment. George, where do you land on The Apartment versus Faces?
They are so different. If it were all about ambition, I'd probably go with Faces. No, I'm going to agree with Jim. The Apartment, it's a lot easier to turn to at certain times when you want to watch a movie that you really like.
Okay, so George is with The Apartment. Let's see what the voters had to say on April 16th, 2016. And ladies and gentlemen, the winner is... And it is The Apartment, and it was a clean sweep. But it is a number 1 seed overall. You would expect a number 1 seed to win against a 16 seed, although we have had some 16 seeds upsets, but this is not one of them. And the likability of characters was the biggest factor in the vote. I mean, obviously the characters in The Apartment are so much more likable and identifiable than a lot of the characters in Faces, I think. And the voters felt like they really wanted to empathize with the characters, and that just wasn't the case in Faces. And as far as I'm concerned, The Apartment is a top 25 all-time movie for me, so that it was a no-brainer. Not that I voted or had to vote, didn't need to break a tie, but I just wanted the audience to know that I'm also on board with The Apartment. I'm a huge fan. We actually did the films as a double feature. What I didn't mention earlier is we did Apartment, then Faces, and then went to San Diego. So it was a huge day.
That's a rough day.
It was a fun day. Are you kidding? It was great.
Huh.
It's one of my best days ever. So, guys, any reactions to vote? No surprise, I guess, huh?
No.
I think George actually hit the nail on the head. Wanting to spend time with a movie that you like. I don't know if Faces is really a movie that you can like. You can get behind some of the themes and explore it. I don't know if it's a likable film.
The Apartment has a lot of unlikable characters in it too, but at its center, it has two people that you like very much.
I mean, a lot of movies are going to have villains. But the point is, The Apartment has two people at the heart of it that you get behind. All right, guys, I'm going to close things out. I mean, it seems like that was Jim's closing thought, but we'll give him another chance in case he has anything else. So it's time for closing thoughts, and I am going to let George go first. Anything you want to say to wrap things up, George?
Yeah, you had asked me early on if I actually liked the film. Sometimes for me, that's secondary to whether or not something hits me in a way that makes me care about people or look at people differently. This film did succeed in doing that. It's something I've thought about quite a lot over the years. I do think it's one of his best movies. I'm glad we watched it. I'm glad we talked about it. I think in our conversation of it, it was obvious that we didn't tune it out. It strikes a chord. It's just a very unique chord, and it doesn't have the easy polish of, oh, I love that movie. It's more something that catches you off guard, and I appreciate that about it very much.
Jim, closing thoughts.
I feel like I've said everything that I need to say.
Yeah.
Hey, I'd love to close things out. Are you kidding? Which that brings us to the trivia. The trivia for our next classic, which is going to be, golly, in November sometime. And our trivia is a baseball movie that would introduce the world to one of our greatest actors, someone who would go on to win 2 Oscars. And that's our next classic coming up. But before that, this upcoming Monday will be our sound off, in which George will be back, and we'll have Patrick as well. We're going to play the movie game. I'm finally get to play the movie game with someone that might be able to beat me in George. We're going to do the segment named after one of Jim's favorite saying, What's Their Bucket? A segment that looks at famous character actors in history. And I am to count down my top 5 John Cassavetes films based on tonight's discussion of Faces. And that's coming up this upcoming Monday. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.